Welcome back to Daily Bread. This is our Reading the Year in a Bible experiment, and this day is January 4th, 2020. And we are looking at Genesis chapter 13 through 17. So there's a lot to unpack here. Let's get right into it. So in chapter 13, we see that Abram and Lot, which is his brother's son, his nephew, they are looking to separate because they're growing both very wealthy and they are able to have a lot of resources and cattle, and they need herdsmen. And there's some tension growing between the herdsmen of their respective clans because it's just a lot to inhabit and a lot of animals to support in a small area. And so Abraham says, let's look in front of the area out here, and let Lot, why don't you go ahead and choose some of the land that looks pleasing to you? And so Lot looks around and chooses the land by the plain of Jordan. So this will become the land that's kind of outside of where Canaan is at, and where the conquest of Judah and the promised land happens. So the Israelites, the 12 descendants that we will be looking at featuring coming up in a little while, that ancestry is not a part of this lineage that Lot chooses and places, which is kind of setting up this area for the conquest of Canaan, and then also the time where King David comes to rule, and explains why the Ammonites and also the Moabites are outside of this area of conquest. So we'll look at a little bit more of the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all these sort of tribes that come up and are directly around the descendants of Abraham. But we'll explain a little bit more later on coming up in following chapters. So Lot and Abram, they decide to split apart. Lot goes by this place, by the plain of Jordan, around these cities called Sodom and Gomorrah, which we will hear a little bit more about later on. And in the stead of Lot's absence is where God tells Abraham to just look around at this place. This is the land I am promising to you. This is, in fact, the promised land your descendants will inhabit. And he invites Abram to take a tour of the land. So that ends chapter 13. Chapter 14, we get into some war. And Lot becomes a prisoner of war due to the conflicts of the kingdoms around him. And Abraham decides to rescue his nephew by force. After rescuing his son, or his brother's son, we see that Abram has an encounter with the king of Sodom and also this king of Salem who was in the battle called Melchizedek. So he's a priest of the Most High God as well, which is the God who Abram is following as well too. And so you've got this king, this random king, giving a kind of blessing to Abram, which this theme is going to be echoed a lot coming up in Hebrews, and Jesus will be talking about this. Christians especially will be talking about this, and Jesus will mention a little bit about the priestly order of Melchizedek, but that is going to be definitely picked up in Hebrews as a central theme to say that God is blessing people, the Most High God is blessing people independent of the Jewish community in their day and time, which was kind of claiming the Pharisaic and the Pharisaic tradition, and Sadducees of Jesus' day and time were claiming to kind of have a central hold on God's authority. And so for Christians, early Christians, they wanted to establish their legitimacy from something that was even above what Christians and Jews were claiming as their joint heritage, somebody above Abram, which was this Melchizedek. So that's probably way too much. He's just a passing figure in this chapter in our narrative of Genesis, but he'll be very important in the book of Hebrews when we explore that later on. So we see that God favors Abram, and that it shows that it was God. Melchizedek talks about how it was God who is the one who delivers the enemies of Abraham into Abram's hand. So this also is kind of setting up that the other character who is there with the king of Salem is the king of Sodom. And the king of Sodom's not really buying too much of it. It's setting up some conflict, and I believe setting up the upcoming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which will happen later on in a few chapters. So that ends chapter 14. Chapter 15, we look and see that Abram is worried about his future. He's heard these promises of God, and he's wanting to see them come to fruition. And this is a very pastoral chapter because this is where God kind of comforts him. So Abram is unsure, but he sees that he is going to listen to God and offer these animal sacrifices, this blood for blood type of thing. These sacrifices are gifts that Abram is giving to God because he hopes and expects the God giving him this great gift, and really is appreciative of it coming forward, but also anxious about what that might look like. So God essentially tells him to trust, and God reassures him, and Abraham does in fact trust. And God reckons it to him as righteousness, or we can call it faithfulness or trust. It's this concept of Abram letting go of his uncertainty and putting his faith into God, which is often why Abram is called this figure of faith, is because repeatedly he is called to trust in God, and he does that on many different levels. Though I would not say he does that perfectly. He does that imperfectly as a human, but his trust is very much to be revered. And following our cycle of God, as we talked about in our overview of it, that human acceptance of what God is doing always leads to God's blessing them. And here we have a perfect example of Abram accepting what God has to say for him. So, anyways, next we look at God referencing a little in this discussion about his descendants being Abram's descendants being strangers in a land that is not theirs. Specifically Genesis 15 verse 6. Talks about this 400 years, and Abraham will go away in peace, but they shall come again in a generation time. Fourth generation is what I have. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet fulfilled. Now, the Amorites are important to know, because the Amorites are they are in that Canaanite tree. They are in the tree of the descendants of Ham. And remember that Ham was the one who did this really shady thing to Noah and gets cursed because of that. And part of that descendants are the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Amorites. And so this whole thing is going back into this kind of connected of saying we are going to offer up this promised land, and we're not going to feel guilty for the iniquity of those other people, of the Amorites. We're not going to feel guilty about all of these things that they did previously, which in some ways is kind of feels kind of terrible that God is choosing these individuals over other individuals, and God through the writer is setting up this justification of this conquest of the Holy Land. But that's in the writer's mind is how he's trying to justify, this whole upcoming conquest of Canaan, which we'll be looking at coming up in later books. So anyways, let's move on to Genesis chapter 16, where Sarai is a little concerned about the promise herself, gives Hagar to be the wife of Abram, and through Hagar produces Ishmael. This also leads to conflict between Hagar and Sarai, I should say, Hagar and Sarai. and sees that she becomes despised in her eyes. Sarai becomes despised in Hagar's eyes, I should say. And then that leads to a counter battle between Sarai, and Sarai, treats Hagar poorly, and Hagar runs away. But God talks her down and calms and says that I will still bless your son Ishmael, even though I will not bless him quite like I'm planning to bless Isaac coming up. So he names him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction. And Ishmael was born to Abram when Abram is 86 years. So Genesis 17, now a 13-year gap. Ishmael is now 13 years old. This is where the big name change and why I've been slipping up on the names for a little while. This guy Abram, this one who follows God and is wandering with him, has a name change. His name is now changed to Abraham, for he will be the father of many nations. That's a Jewish or a Hebrew pun on his name, Abraham, and so father of many nations. God talks about how he will give birth to kings, and he will literally cut a covenant with him through the cutting of a foreskin, like I talked about before in a previous one of these, that you cut a covenant. That's how you make a covenant, is you literally cut it. And here we see again the katar, the cutting, through the act of institution of circumcision. So this is literally a covenant of your literal flesh, as it says in verse 13. It's a promise incarnate in the blessings of people. And so for we as Christians, we see we don't really depend upon circumcision as the blessing, but this would be what a similar kind of incarnational theology that you could have here, this blessing made incarnate. For us Christians, we believe Jesus is the blessing made incarnate, God's only Son, God's humanity made incarnate, showing us God with us, as we just recently celebrated at Christmas time and are still in the season of Christmas celebrating that. But this is the way that the specialness is obtained and the blessing is continued, for God's people. And so it's kind of funny in some ways that Ishmael is even circumcised, and God's blessing is extended even to what will become, the Muslim community as well too. That we as both, Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all children of Abraham. We are children of the same Most High God, even if we, kind of disagree on some of the elements of, how that might be made manifest. That's something that we as Lutheran Christians especially claim to, that we are connected in the same Most High God and a faith around that, going back to this heritage all the way in Genesis to Abraham. So anyways, that is a lot for one day to unpack, but we will continue on in the Abraham story a little bit more, and we will pick that up coming up tomorrow. So thank you for joining us for day 4 of Daily Bread.